Today we're talking about the top 10 board wipes you're not playing, but not just the top 10 board wipes you're not playing, the top 10 board wipes you're not playing that give you an advantage after you cast them. Because that's my problem with these farewell effects. They do an amazing job at resetting the entire board state, even the graveyard, but they don't do anything to put you ahead of your opponents. So it's just a race to see who can build the biggest board state the fastest after this board wipe. So that's my goal with these board wipes we're talking about today. I want them to put you ahead of your opponents automatically after casting them. So without further ado, let's get into these board wipes and shout out those patrons. Irrelevant, you rock. Let's talk about our first board wipe. And right out of the gate, this one's going to see the most play, so it's going to be at our number 10 spot with Coing Ritual. Now, I think a lot of what pushes this card to seeing a ton of play is actually the CEDH format. This is amazing in CEDH and everybody knows it, so in any Gilgari deck that can run this, they're going to run this. And I think that pushes the play, but I think casual players can really benefit from it as well. Gilgari is a color pairing that's super easy to build back using the graveyard, and all we need to do that 9 times out of 10 is a ton of mana. So not only does this give you a ton of mana, we're already in amazing colors to get utility out of our graveyard. And then another thing that really causes us to want to run this Coing Ritual in our Gilgari decks is 9 times out of 10 our ramp in Gilgari is going to be land based, so we're putting lands into play. A lot of the other format in other colors cares about signets, talismans, soul ring, and that is what's going to get wiped out whenever we cast this Coing Ritual 9 times out of 10, and then it's really good against token strategies as well. So I challenge you Gilgari players to try this out. It just wins games. Here's one for all of you aggro players out there. We have Spectacular Showdown. Now I know this card doesn't look like a board wipe, but I promise you if you've ever overloaded it for 7 mana, you're gonna understand exactly what I'm saying. Now let's read what this card does. For 2 mana, you can put a double strike counter on a creature, and then you're gonna goad each creature that got a double strike counter put on it this way. And then you can overload it. So you can put a double strike counter on every single creature on the board and then goad every single creature on the board. Now what's going to happen is that's going to force your opponents to attack each other. And then your opponents are going to be incentivized to block just to mitigate as much damage as possible. And then when it gets back around to your turn, your entire board's going to have double strike counters on them, and you can kind of remove one of the players that's being the biggest problem. And then in that, everybody's going to lose a ton of key pieces, and it's going to put you on top because, again, you're going to get rid of the biggest threat, and you're going to have the most creatures left over from this quote-unquote board wipe or board swing, right? This is an amazing card, and I've used it to win a ton of games. That overloaded cost or overloaded ability is absolutely insane and honestly pretty underrated. Moving on to number 8, we have Fade from History. Not only is this super budget, but additionally, it's really good in your creature-based strategies. It's simple. It just gets rid of all artifacts, all enchantments, and it only costs 4 CMC. Now, it's going to give some people some bears, but we don't really care about that. We really just want the benefit of getting rid of all of our opponent's key artifacts and enchantments while our creature strategy is untouched. Moving on, we're going to talk about Anzrag's Rampage. Now, this looks like another card we play a lot, but it's a little bit different. Anzrag's Rampage is going to destroy all of your opponent's artifacts, and then it's going to exile the top X cards of our library, where X is the amount of artifacts destroyed this way, and then we're going to go ahead and look deep, find a creature card, throw it right onto the battlefield, and then we are going to have to return that to our hand. But for one turn, we probably get a broken creature card. This is going to be really good in your strategies that care about artifacts because it actually does count the artifacts that we sacrifice, right? So in a artifact strategy that sacrifices artifacts that needs to find key cards, this could kind of be a card that digs you deep to find your key creatures. And then additionally, it can just be a solid value piece that gets rid of all of your opponent's artifacts while digging you deep, finding you a creature that you can shove onto the battlefield. Now, notably, I would only run this in a deck that runs a high amount of creatures because you really don't want to whiff on this. I'm pretty sure those cards are exiled forever, but you know, it's okay. We have a 100 card deck. It's all right to exile a few of them. Am I right? Now, moving on to our next one, we have Mandate of Abdon. And I think this one sees less play, mostly because a lot of people only run this if you have a creature with very high power in the command zone, but I think you could run this in a lot of other decks, right? It's just super flexible, and you can choose different creatures depending on how much of your board you're willing to lose. Maybe you have a bunch of 3/3s, you can just choose 3 and you get rid of everybody's 1/1s and 2/2s. You know, this card's a lot more flexible than people give it credit for, and it's super cheap for a board wipe. We're talking talking only 5 mana for a one-sided board wipe that can really put you ahead of your opponents. Let's talk about Fraline for a second, because this is a super interesting colorless board wipe that can actually exile creatures, plus it can go in any deck since it's colorless. So it's 4 CMC, it enters the battlefield, and you get to put a rope counter on one of your creatures. And then at each player's upkeep, they can spend 2 mana and put a rope counter on one of their creatures. And then whenever a player fails to do that, it's going to exile all creatures without a rope counter on it, get rid of all rope counters on all creatures, and then go ahead and exile itself. So this sets you up to be ahead of your opponents because it's going to protect your most key creature. And then I want you to think about a time when one player was super ahead and the other players didn't also want a board wipe, because that's why this card is strong. 9 times out of 10, you're going to put a rope counter on your thing, and then the very next player is going to fail to put a rope counter on one of their things because they really want to wipe the board and they don't want the scary player to untap. Now, this card isn't as strong if the scary player is right next to you, because he's probably going to try to kill you because he doesn't want his board wipe to get or his board to get exiled. So, you know, it's kind of you having to hope that the player right next to you isn't the problem, but it's still a very flexible board wipe, and it actually has a commander that synergizes amazing with it, with Vorinclex, mono green Vorinclex, because what's going to happen is your opponents are going to be unable to put any rope counters on their creatures, because Vorinclex is just going to say, yeah, go ahead, put 1 on it, and then I'm going to reduce that by 1. So boom, Vorinclex is really good here. The next one we're talking about is super simple but super effective. It's Oversimplify. You see what I did there? This card's amazing because it's actually in Simic, and Simic doesn't have a lot of ways to just straight up remove creatures, let alone exile it, which is what this card does. You exile all creatures on the battlefield, and then each player gets a Fractal token equal to the amount of power they had exiled. So if you had the biggest creatures, you end up with the biggest token, but 9 times out of 10, that's not going to matter. We really just want to get rid of everybody's creatures in Simic. But there's a lot of strategies that care about the counters or having a big creature. Whether you're in a graveyard deck, you have a big creature to sacrifice, or even sometimes you have a Savala that can tap for a bunch of mana. I mean, obviously you'd need that in your hand, not on the battlefield, because we're exiling the entire battlefield. But this is just a very useful board wipe in Simic, which is a color pairing that doesn't have access to a ton of board wipes. The next board wipe we're going to be talking about is something I think we should be running over your farewell effects, which is crazy, right? But it's Everything Comes to Dust. Now, this essentially does the same thing Farewell does, minus the graveyard hate. It exiles all creatures, all artifacts, all enchantments, with the caveat, it's not going to exile the creatures with the same typing of creatures used to convoke it. So if you tap down a bunch of soldier tokens to kill everything, it's going to or exile everything except for those soldier tokens. Now, I know this works for your opponents as well, but 9 times out of 10, you can pick and choose what you use to convoke it, and that's going to hose over your opponents, and then you're going to have a meaningful board state after it. The next card we're going to be talking about is Out of Time, and this one's super simple. For 3 mana, it enters the battlefield, and you phase out all creatures. Then you're going to put a time counter on Out of Time for each creature phased out this way, and then when Out of Time runs out of these counters, you go ahead and remove it from the battlefield, and all creatures come back. Now, what this does is it actually hoses over your opponent's decks if they're commander reliant, because phasing something out does not give them an opportunity to say, hey, I want to put my commander back in the command zone. No, that creature's just gone. So it can effectively get rid of all of your opponent's commanders and hose them over. Now, you will have 3 opponents kind of upset trying to remove your Out of Time, but sometimes enchantment removal is not always vast, so this does end up sticking on the battlefield for a while till someone finds an answer. And then again, if you're an Enzorius and you got those counter spells, it can just be a very brutal card to play against that just flat out shuts decks off. Moving on to the last one, and the number 1 card I think you should be playing that you're not, it's Filter Out. This card's super budget, and at instant speed, it just returns all non-creature permanents to your opponent's hand. That looks like a 3 mana Cyclonic Rift to me, and it almost is, right? Minus the creature effect. Now, I know we're in casual, creatures are pretty important, but the fact that it works on everything except creatures, it's kind of crazy to me that this doesn't see more play, especially since it's only 3 mana, because for 3 mana, we're hosing over those enchantment decks, we're hosing over those artifact decks, and we can do this on our opponent's instep, same as Cyclonic Rift, and be the first one to build back if we are in an artifact or enchantment strategy. Sometimes it will even help us out. If we care about casting a bunch of artifacts or enchantments, we can just return them all back to our hand to cast them again to reset all of our benefits, right? Get our ETBs again. It's going to be a very useful card, and I think it needs and deserves more play. With that being said, guys, that brings us to the end of the video. If you guys have any suggestions for these top 10 videos, leave them in the comments down below, along with your top 10 underrated board wipes, right? Because let's add to it, let's find that tech, and let's utilize it in our decks. With that being said, I hope this helped you in your deck building endeavors, and I will see you in the next one.